Good evening and welcome. I'm your host, Liz Wheeler, and this is Tipping Point. Tonight, the mainstream media falls for fake news from the alt-right. The liberal media actually became the megaphone for racists yesterday when they published an erroneous report that claimed Parkland High School shooter Nicholas Cruz was a confirmed white supremacist, part of a white supremacist group called the Republic of Florida. That based on claims by the group's leader. The local sheriff, however, contradicted that report, saying law enforcement knows of no such ties between Cruz and the white supremacist group. The leader of the group later backtracked his claims, saying it was all a hoax. Why the media rushed to publish fake news in just moments with Inez Felcher. Then the FBI releases a damning statement admitting they let Nicholas Cruz slip through the cracks when they had a credible warning 1 month ago that Cruz might commit a school shooting, and they did not follow protocol to investigate the information at all. Sagar Angetti joins us shortly for that. Plus, a big win for conservatives on college campuses. A court rules in their favor, saying the University of Washington cannot charge the college Republicans security fees that are based on the expected violent reaction from protesters. The chair of the University of Washington College Republicans joins us later. But first, as always, thank you for being here tonight because our nation is at a tipping point. If we don't turn America towards liberty, then we risk losing the freedom that makes America exceptional. And that, of course, brings us to our first tipping point tonight. The mainstream media falls for fake news from the alt-right. The liberal media actually became the megaphone for racists yesterday when they published an erroneous report that claimed Parkland High School shooter Nicholas Cruz was a confirmed white supremacist, part of a white supremacist group called the Republic of Florida. This was based on claims by that group's leader. The local sheriff, however, contradicted that report, saying law enforcement knows of no such ties between Cruz and the white supremacist group. The leader of the group later backtracked his claims, saying it was all a hoax. Now, the question does remain, is Nicholas Cruz a white supremacist? Was he motivated by a radical ideology, a racist ideology, a religious ideology? The journalistically honest answer to that is we don't know. We don't know Cruz's motivation for his attack that left 17 people dead. We don't know his political, religious, or social beliefs, or if those beliefs impacted his murderous spree. What we do know is the liberal media and talking heads on the left jumped at the chance to assign blame to the shooter where they wanted. The left wanted to believe the white supremacist leader who claimed Cruz trained with their group because the media wants Cruz to be a white supremacist. Now let's be very clear here for a second. White supremacy is a twisted, murderous, heinous ideology that should be squashed. The fringe maniacs in our nation who adhere to these despicable racist beliefs should be ostracized from our society as best we can. And in the case of crimes committed in the name of that ideology, locked away for the rest of their lives. Period. So why was the liberal media practically giddy then yesterday with this phony report of Cruz being a white supremacist? Why did they perpetuate fake news from the mouth of an alt-right white supremacist himself? The answer to this is simple. Politics. The left wants Cruz to be a white supremacist because they've spent the past 2 years falsely accusing any American who voted for Donald Trump of being a Nazi. The left wants Cruz to be a white supremacist so they can blame Donald Trump and Trump voters for the murderous actions of Nicholas Cruz, since they've been calling Trump voters white supremacists anyway. Isn't that disgusting? 17 people are dead, and the media doesn't even wait to verify a sketchy report before they call it confirmed and use that report to blame Trump voters for a mass shooting? They don't blame the shooter. They don't even condemn a disgusting fringe ideology. They blame Donald Trump, and they blame you. Joining me now, senior contributor to The Federalist, Inez Felcher. Inez, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
All right, Inez, talk to me about this. Am I wrong about the left wanting to believe that Nicholas Cruz is a white supremacist?
You know, it used to be this kind of fake news coming out after a major incident was confined to Twitter, confined to kind of fringe news sites, but this bit of fake news was published by CBS, it was published by CNN. I myself thought it was true when I saw it be published with CBS and CNN. And it turns out it was all based around the word of a white supremacist in Florida who then backtracked on it and said that he was actually thinking of a different Nicholas, not Nicholas Cruz. And so the mainstream media really perpetuated this bit of fake news, which is particularly damaging immediately in the immediate aftermath after this kind of attack when false information is flying around the internet.
Right, and listen, I don't have a problem with media organizations, even ones that lean liberal. I don't have a problem with them reporting what this alt-right white supremacist leader said. He did say it. He did claim that Nicholas Cruz was part of his organization, but that's not what they reported. That's not what the media said. They didn't say the leader of a white supremacist organization claims that Nicholas Cruz was part of it. They immediately jumped to confirmed white supremacist Nicholas Cruz, probably a Trump supporter, waged murder, and what can you expect in this age of divisive, violent rhetoric sparked by Donald Trump? They tried immediately to make that tie, yet it was fake news. I have not seen any retractions today.
Yeah, a lot of times they just updated the stories, right? So and CNN, for example, has a scrolling updated story on the shooting, and they just updated the story. So yeah, they really haven't issued massive retractions. And as you said, this piece of news was reported as though it were confirmed. Depending on the outlet, I will say, depending on the outlet, some outlets only reported it as the ADL, which initially broke this and called the white supremacist leader. They initially they didn't say that they were saying it, but they said, oh, the ADL is reporting this, and this white supremacist leader has said this. That's an acceptable form of reporting, but some of them really ran with it.
No, and especially some of the pundits, the talking heads, who go on cable news and who dominate these conversations on Twitter, they certainly were not reporting it as if it were unverified. They were reporting it as if it were confirmed. I checked the Twitter outlets of many of these people today. Those tweets are still on their profiles. They have not been retracted, they have not been deleted, and they have not been corrected. Shame on them for perpetuating fake news. And as I want to talk about a couple of other instances of fake news as it relates to this Parkland High School shooting, there are claims being made by the left that President Trump made it easier for people with mental illnesses to get their hands on firearms. They're saying, well, it's Trump's fault in this way, too. Not only the white supremacy aspect, but also this way, because this kid was a trouble kid. There are reports that he was mentally ill. I think one of his cousins or a relative said that he was on psychiatric medication. Liberals are now saying that Trump rolled back regulations that would have prevented this kid from getting his hand on a gun. Is that true?
No, so these regulations, first of all, probably would not have applied to Cruz. And second of all, the regulations they rolled back were actually incredibly broad. And I would think that civil libertarians and liberals who are concerned with civil liberties would be nervous about them as well. Actually, these regulations swept in anyone who claimed disability on Social Security from basically saying that they should not be able to pass a background check to acquire a firearm. That's an incredibly broad decision for a bureaucrat to make, right? This is an agency decision. This is not accessible to democratic accountability. This is not a court that made this decision. It was a federal agency staffed with bureaucrats who decided that everyone who had ever claimed disability on Social Security should be banned from purchasing a firearm. That's very broad, and that should worry more than the right. That should be a civil libertarian issue.
Well, it is. And the funny thing is, as liberals are condemning the fact that President Trump rolled this back because it was an obvious violation of our Fourth Amendment, there was no due process involved here. The ACLU actually condemned this regulation too. They agreed with what President Trump did. The ACLU agreed with President Trump, but to liberals, that's not enough. All right, the last piece of fake news here, the gun control narrative that has been dominating everywhere. It's been dominating all the news stories, all the cable news, all the networks, all the publications, Twitter, social media conversations. And this liberal narrative is saying that gun control laws would have prevented this from happening. If we banned AR-15s, if we essentially implemented an Australian-style gun confiscation program, that would prevent mass shootings from happening. Inez, if we look at the gun control laws that we have implemented in our nation since the founding of our nation, but particularly in modern times, have any of our strict gun control laws actually reduced gun violence?
There's not a lot of evidence for that proposition at all. In fact, even Australia, where liberals point to a full, by the way, that's a full confiscation. That's not, quote unquote, common sense gun control, right? That's full confiscation and buyback programs. And the University of Melbourne actually came out a few years ago and said, actually, we don't have a lot of evidence that this confiscation actually had any impact on crime rates. It's true that crime rates in Australia have dipped since they implemented that ban, but they've dipped here in the United States since the 90s as well, and we basically went in the other direction. So the United States, since the early 90s, the number of guns in the United States has doubled, and the crime rate has halved. So there's not a lot of evidence that banning guns or especially the kind of regulations that liberals want to push, like a quote-unquote assault weapons bans or some of these other things they call common sense gun control, those wouldn't have stopped a lot of these shootings. In fact, I'm not aware of any of these shootings that would have been stopped by these. Usually, when there's somebody who's determined to break the law, they're going to find a way to do it. And in addition, a lot of these propositions from the liberals wouldn't have prevented that. Actually, I think it's a shame that we always end up having this conversation about gun control immediately after these kind of school shootings or mass shootings, because it crowds out a lot of the real conversations we could be having instead that might actually produce solutions. For example, what happened with the FBI, and I know you're going to cover that coming up. What happened with the FBI ignoring 2 separate tips about this guy? And furthermore, what about publicity? What about the fact that we splashed the shooter's name across all of the papers? Is there a conversation we should have around that? These are real conversations that we should be having, as opposed to just rehashing all of the same talking points. The left brings up the same, often very flawed statistics or misleading reports, like the idea that there were 18 school shootings so far this year. That is not true. They bring up all this misleading information, and we retread the same arguments every time instead of really looking at places where we might actually have an impact and prevent some of these tragedies from occurring in the future.
Right, no, you're absolutely right. And you know who I blame for that? I blame politicians who aren't interested in finding actual solutions. They're only interested in pushing their agenda, exploiting tragedy, exploiting emotion to get their agenda passed. And I blame the mainstream media that peddles fake news like we just talked about. Why don't we have a conversation about mental health? Why don't we have a conversation about why schools, public schools specifically, government entities, government buildings don't have security when our kids are filling the schools? I mean, all other government buildings have security except the buildings with children in them. That makes no sense. Let's have that conversation instead. Inez, thanks for coming on the show. Thanks for your insight. All right, guys, don't go anywhere. We do have Sagar and Jetty here next. The FBI admits they did not follow protocol and investigate Nicholas Cruz after they received a credible tip in January from a person close to Cruz warning them about Cruz's gun ownership, his desire to kill people, his erratic behavior, his disturbing social media posts, and the possibility of his conducting a school shooting. That is coming up next.